Anton Novak watched the temperature drop to 28 degrees below zero through the frost-covered window of his Montana cabin, but he didn't add wood to any fire. The iron hatch in his floor remained closed, radiating steady warmth from the brick-lined chamber 1 foot beneath his floorboards, while his neighbors 3 miles away burned through their last cords of firewood, trying to survive the coldest January in living memory. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation like this one fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1842 arrived early in the northern Rocky Mountains. Anton Novak and Joseph Dvorak had established their trapping camp in late September, building a cabin near a creek that fed into the Yellowstone River drainage. The location offered everything 2 Bohemian immigrants needed: abundant beaver, fresh water, timber for construction, and isolation from the increasingly crowded trapping territories further south. They had worked together for 3 seasons, and their partnership functioned with the quiet efficiency of men who understood each other without excessive conversation. Their cabin was unremarkable by frontier standards. They had selected logs of reasonable straightness, notched them at the corners, using the saddle technique most trappers employed, and chinked the gaps with moss and mud mixed with whatever clay they could find near the creek bank. The structure measured 12 feet by 14 feet, large enough for 2 men to live without constantly colliding, small enough to heat with a single fireplace. They had built that fireplace from river stones mortared with mud, creating a crude but functional chimney that rose through the roof. The door was simple, planks held together with crosspieces and hung on leather hinges. 1 small window covered with oiled paper provided light. The entire construction had taken them 6 days. It was adequate. That was the standard on the frontier. Cabins didn't need to be exceptional, just good enough to keep out wind and rain and provide a place to sleep between days of hard work. Anton and Joseph had lived in worse structures during their first years in America. This cabin represented progress, a sign they were establishing themselves in this harsh but opportunity-rich wilderness. On the evening of November 19, 1842, the temperature began dropping rapidly. Anton noticed it first when he stepped outside to relieve himself before bed. The cold hit his face like a physical blow, sharp and penetrating, in a way that signaled something unusual. The sky was clear, stars visible in numbers that only frontier darkness allowed, and the air had that peculiar stillness that preceded the most brutal cold snaps. He mentioned it to Joseph before they slept. Joseph shrugged. Cold was expected. They had firewood stacked against the cabin wall. They would be fine. By morning, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. The water bucket inside the cabin had developed a thin layer of ice despite the fire they had maintained through the night. Joseph rose early, as he usually did, and prepared to check their trap lines. Anton suggested they both stay near the cabin until the cold broke, but Joseph dismissed the concern. Traps needed checking. Beaver didn't stop moving just because the weather turned harsh. He dressed in his heaviest clothes, took his rifle, and left the cabin shortly after dawn. Anton spent the day inside, tending the fire and working on equipment repairs. Anton found Joseph 3 hours after the sun reached its highest point. He had heard no gunshot, no call for help, nothing that would indicate trouble. But as afternoon stretched toward evening, and Joseph still had not returned, Anton gathered his rifle and followed the trail his partner had taken toward the eastern trap line. The tracks were easy to follow in the fresh snow that had fallen during the morning, each footprint clear and purposeful, until they simply stopped beside a frozen beaver pond. Joseph lay on his side near the ice edge, his rifle 10 feet away where it had fallen. There were no signs of animal attack, no blood, no struggle. The cold had simply taken him. Anton would learn later from other trappers that Joseph had likely broken through thin ice while checking a trap, gotten soaked, and attempted to return to the cabin. He had made it less than a quarter mile before his body surrendered to the temperature. Death from exposure could happen that quickly when conditions aligned against you. Anton dragged Joseph's body back to the cabin on a makeshift sled constructed from branches. It took 4 hours. By the time he arrived, full darkness had settled, and the temperature had dropped further. He spent that night sitting beside Joseph's frozen corpse, unable to process what had happened. They had been careful men. They had survived 3 seasons together. Joseph had been competent, experienced, not reckless. But competence meant nothing when the cold decided to kill you. The next morning, Anton dug a grave on a hillside overlooking the creek. The ground was frozen solid. He had to build a fire and let it burn for hours to soften the earth enough to excavate. He buried Joseph with his rifle and marked the site with stones arranged in a cross pattern. He spoke no formal words over the grave. Joseph had not been a religious man, and Anton barely remembered the prayers from his childhood in Bohemia. What stayed with Anton during the days that followed was not grief, though grief existed, but a growing fixation on the fundamental inadequacy of their cabin. Joseph had died outside, yes, but the cabin itself offered no real sanctuary. Anton began paying attention to details he had previously ignored. The fireplace consumed enormous amounts of wood, but generated heat that rose immediately, up the chimney and disappeared into the sky. The gaps between logs, despite their chinking efforts, allowed cold air to seep constantly inward. The door fit poorly in its frame, creating a draft that no amount of adjustment could eliminate. At night, even with the fire burning steadily, the temperature inside the cabin remained brutally cold unless you sat within 3 feet of the flames. Anton realized that their cabin, like every trapper cabin he had ever seen, was designed to meet minimum standards. It kept out rain, it blocked wind, it provided walls and a roof, but it did not actually protect anyone from serious cold. It was a shelter, not a fortress. And that distinction, Anton became convinced, was the difference between life and death. Anton completed the trapping season alone. He worked Joseph's trap lines in addition to his own, processing pelts with mechanical efficiency while his mind circled endlessly around the problem of heat retention. By the time spring arrived in 1843, he had accumulated enough furs to justify the 3-week journey to St. Louis. Most trappers made this trip with anticipation, eager to sell their season's work and spend money on whiskey, gambling, and temporary companionship. Anton had different priorities. He sold his pelts to a trading company on the riverfront for a respectable sum, negotiated carefully, and collected his payment in hard currency. Then, instead of joining other trappers in the tavern district, he began walking through the city's industrial areas. St. Louis was growing rapidly, transforming from a frontier outpost into a genuine city with brick buildings, paved streets, and craftsmen practicing trades that barely existed in the wilderness. Anton spent 2 full days observing a bakery operation near the waterfront. The bakery used massive brick ovens that held heat for hours after the fires inside had died down. Anton watched the bakers build fires early in the morning, let them burn intensely for several hours, then rake out the coals and slide loaves directly onto the hot brick surfaces. The ovens continued baking bread throughout the day, using only the heat stored in the brick mass. No continuous fire, no constant fuel consumption, just thermal mass doing work long after the flames had disappeared. He spoke with the head baker, a German immigrant who explained the principle with patient clarity. Brick absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. The thicker the brick walls, the longer they retained warmth. A well-built brick oven could stay hot enough for baking 24 hours after the last fire had burned out. The key was mass and insulation, weight and containment. Anton spent another week studying construction sites. He watched masons laying foundations, noting how they fitted bricks together with mortar joints that created rigid, unified structures. He observed a blacksmith forging iron brackets and hinges, learning what thickness of metal was required to support heavy loads without bending. He visited a warehouse where carpenters were installing heavy doors with reinforced frames, examining how hinges were mortised into wood to prevent forced entry. People thought he was strange. A mountain man in buckskin studying bakery ovens and construction techniques drew curious stares and occasional mockery. Anton ignored them. He was learning principles that solved his problem, and frontier pride was irrelevant compared to survival. Before leaving St. Louis, Anton spent nearly half his fur money on materials that made no sense to other trappers. He purchased 60 fire bricks from a mason supplier, paying extra to have them wrapped carefully for transport. He bought a custom-forged iron door from a blacksmith, rectangular with 2 small vent holes and a heavy handle, weighing 35 pounds. He acquired specialized woodworking tools, packets of mortar mix, and iron pins for construction. Other trappers, heading back to the mountains with standard supplies, looked at his purchases with open confusion. Anton returned to the mountains in late July of 1843 with his unusual cargo distributed across 2 pack horses. The journey took longer than usual because the bricks required careful handling to prevent breakage. He lost 3 bricks to an accident when one horse stumbled crossing a creek, but the rest arrived intact. When he reached the site where Joseph had died, Anton made an immediate decision. He would not rebuild on the same location. The old cabin held too many memories, and, more practically, he wanted to start completely fresh with a design that incorporated everything he had learned. He selected a new site, 200 yards upstream, on slightly elevated ground that offered good drainage and clear sight lines in multiple directions. The location was less convenient for water access, but Anton prioritized other factors. He wanted his cabin above potential flood levels and positioned where approaching threats, whether animal or human, would be visible from a distance. The first step was excavating the chamber that would hold his hidden ember bed. Anton measured carefully, marking a rectangle 3 feet wide and 4 feet long in the center of where his cabin floor would eventually sit. Then he began digging. The work was brutally difficult. He had to remove soil to a depth of 1 foot, creating a chamber with perfectly vertical walls and a flat bottom. The excavation alone took 5 days. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Lucas Kovacs rode into Anton's camp. Kovacs was a Hungarian trapper who worked territory about 8 miles south. He had heard through the scattered frontier communication network that the Bohemian who had lost his partner was back and building something. Curiosity had brought him to investigate. Kovacs sat on his horse and stared at the rectangular hole Anton had dug. He looked at the pile of fire bricks stacked nearby. He examined the heavy iron door leaning against a tree. Then he started laughing. "You are digging a grave for your firewood," Kovacs said in his thick accent. "This is what happens when a man spends too much time alone. You have gone mad, Novak." Anton continued working, using a flat stone to smooth the bottom of his excavation. He did not argue or explain. Kovacs watched for a few more minutes, made additional jokes about Bohemian stupidity and wasted effort, then rode away still chuckling. Anton heard him laughing, even after he had disappeared into the trees. The mockery did not bother Anton. He had expected it. What he was building contradicted every assumption trappers held about heating and shelter. It looked insane because it was unprecedented. But Anton had done the calculations in his head dozens of times during the journey back from St. Louis. The physics were sound. Thermal mass worked, whether people understood it or not. He began laying bricks the next morning, creating walls that would contain heat, store it, and release it slowly upward through the cabin floor that would eventually sit above this hidden chamber. The brick laying required precision that Anton had never attempted in any previous construction. Each brick needed to sit level with its neighbors, creating walls that were perfectly vertical and corners that formed true right angles. He mixed mortar using the supplies he had purchased in St. Louis, adding water carefully until the consistency allowed the mixture to bind bricks. Without being so wet, it would take weeks to cure. The work was slow and methodical. He laid the first course of bricks around the perimeter of his excavated chamber, checking constantly with a string line to ensure straightness. By the end of the first day, he had completed 1 full course. By the end of the 4th day, he had built up 4 courses, bringing the brick walls to a height that sat 1 foot below where his cabin floor would eventually rest. The interior of the chamber measured exactly 3 feet by 4 feet, sized to hold a substantial bed of coals while remaining small enough that the heat would concentrate rather than dissipate into useless space. Anton continued the brickwork above ground level, creating a raised perimeter that extended 3 inches above where his floor would sit. This lip would serve multiple purposes. It would frame the iron door, prevent floor debris from falling into the chamber, and create a small barrier that would keep embers contained even if the door was opened carelessly. The raised edge took another 2 days to complete. When finished, the structure looked like a brick-lined rectangular well rising slightly above the surrounding ground. The iron door installation was the most critical step. Anton had designed the door dimensions carefully when he commissioned it from the St. Louis blacksmith. It needed to cover the brick opening completely while sitting securely on the raised perimeter. The 2 vent holes cut into the iron were positioned to allow controlled airflow into the chamber below, essential for maintaining coal combustion without creating a roaring fire. Anton tested the fit multiple times, adjusting the brick perimeter with careful grinding until the door sat perfectly flat and stable. He built the cabin walls around the completed ember-bed chamber, using traditional log construction for everything else. The walls went up quickly compared to the painstaking brickwork. He notched the logs at corners, fitted them reasonably well, and chinked the gaps with moss and clay. The cabin was 12 feet square, slightly smaller than the structure he had shared with Joseph. He built a simple sleeping platform, installed a small window with a wooden shutter, and constructed a door using techniques he had observed in St. Louis. Pavel Resnick visited in early September, drawn by the same curiosity that had brought Kovacs weeks earlier. Resnick was a Polish settler who had claimed land 15 miles west, attempting to establish a small farm in territory that was marginal for agriculture. He walked around Anton's nearly completed cabin, examined the brick-lined chamber with the iron door, and shook his head in disbelief. "A fire pit in your floor," Resnick said flatly. "That is the stupidest thing I have ever seen." Anton completed his cabin in the 3rd week of September, exactly 7 weeks after beginning construction. For a frontier structure, this timeline was absurd. Most trappers built serviceable cabins in 4 to 6 days. Anton had invested nearly 50 days of labor into a single-room dwelling that, from the outside, looked no different than any other log structure in the territory. The difference was hidden beneath the floorboards, invisible to anyone who did not understand what they were looking at. Word of Anton's unusual construction spread through the scattered trapping community with surprising speed. Frontier isolation created hunger for novelty, and a bohemian building something strange provided excellent material for campfire conversation. Trappers who had never met Anton knew about the underground oven, the brick-lined hole, the heavy iron door that served no apparent purpose. The story evolved with each retelling, gaining embellishments and increasingly ridiculous details. Gregor Thomas, a trader who moved between trapping camps selling supplies and purchasing furs, stopped at Anton's cabin in early October. Thomas was Slovak, and he spoke with Anton in a mixture of their related languages, easier than the broken English both men used with others. He examined the ember-bed chamber with genuine interest rather than mockery, asking technical questions about the brick depth and the iron door's function. But even Thomas expressed doubt about the practicality. "It is ingenious," Thomas admitted, "but is it worth the effort? You could have built 3 normal cabins in the time you spent on this one." Anton had no answer that would satisfy someone who had not watched a partner freeze to death. He simply shrugged and offered Thomas coffee. They talked about fur prices and winter predictions. Then Thomas departed, carrying the story of Novak's underground oven to the next camp on his circuit. The consensus among the trapping community was clear. Anton Novak had wasted enormous time and resources building something overcomplicated and probably useless. The kindest interpretation was that grief over Joseph's death had driven Anton to obsessive, irrational behavior. The less kind interpretation was that Bohemians were simply impractical people who over-engineered simple problems. Either way, the brick chamber became a regional joke. Built like Novak's oven became a sarcastic phrase meaning unnecessarily complicated. Anton conducted his own private tests throughout October and early November. He experimented with different coal bed depths, learning how much wood he needed to burn down to create embers that would last specific durations. He tested the iron door positioning, discovering that leaving it slightly open during active burning created optimal airflow while closing it completely. Once the coals were established, maximized heat retention. He measured the temperature difference between the air 6 inches above his floor and the air at chest height, confirming that heat radiated upward exactly as he had calculated. By late November, Anton had perfected his technique. A single coal bed, properly established in the morning, would keep his cabin comfortable for 12 hours without adding fuel. The floor radiated steady warmth that never created the intense, localized heat of a fireplace, but maintained livable temperature throughout the entire space. January of 1844 brought weather that old-timers would reference for decades afterward. The cold arrived gradually, a slow descent into temperatures that tested every assumption about winter survival in the northern Rockies. On January 3rd, the temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero. Trappers burned extra wood and stayed close to their fires, but the cold was manageable. On January 5th, it reached 15 below. On January 7th, 20 below. The pattern continued, each day slightly colder than the last, as if the atmosphere itself was being drained of all warmth. Anton monitored the progression with careful attention. Each morning he built his coal bed using wood he had split and dried during the autumn months. He learned that hardwood created coals that lasted longer than pine, that arranging the wood in specific patterns affected how completely it burned down to embers, and that the 1-foot depth of his brick chamber was exactly right for creating the thermal mass he needed. The morning coal bed would burn actively for 3 hours, then settle into glowing embers that radiated heat through the afternoon and evening. In the evening, around sunset, Anton would open the iron door and add more wood, creating a second coal bed that would carry him through the night. The routine became automatic: build the fire, let it burn down, close the door most of the way to retain heat while allowing minimal airflow, and let the thermal mass do its work. The floor of his cabin remained warm enough that he could walk barefoot without discomfort. The air temperature stayed consistently above freezing, even when outside conditions became lethal. By January 10th, the temperature had dropped to 25 degrees below zero. Anton's wood consumption was remarkably low compared to what he had burned in previous winters using conventional fireplaces. He estimated he was using 1/3 the fuel to maintain superior comfort. The brick walls of his hidden chamber absorbed heat during the active burning phases and released it slowly over hours. The system worked exactly as he had designed it to work. His neighbors were struggling. Anton knew this because he could see smoke from their chimneys when he stood on the rise behind his cabin. The smoke was constant, thick columns rising from morning until night as they burned wood continuously trying to stay warm. Lucas Kovac lived closest, about 3 miles southeast. Pavel Resnick was 5 miles west. Other trappers and settlers were scattered across the territory, each isolated in their individual struggle against the cold. On January 12th, the temperature reached 28 below zero. Anton woke that morning, checked the frost patterns on his window, and felt warmth radiating from the floorboards beneath his sleeping platform. He opened the iron door and found coals still glowing from the previous evening's fire. A full 12 hours after he had last added wood. He built his morning coal bed and went about his day with calm efficiency. Outside, the world had become hostile to life. But inside his cabin, protected by 1 foot of brick and the principles of thermal mass, Anton remained comfortable. The temperature stabilized at brutal levels for 10 consecutive nights beginning January 13th. Each morning brought readings between 25 and 32 degrees below zero, cold that killed exposed flesh in minutes and turned ordinary tasks into life-threatening challenges. Anton maintained his routine with disciplined consistency, building his coal beds twice daily and trusting the system he had engineered. His wood supply remained adequate. His cabin stayed warm. The iron door in his floor radiated heat that seemed impossible given how little fuel he consumed. On the evening of January 19th, the 7th night of extreme cold, Anton heard someone shouting outside his cabin. He opened the door to find Lucas Kovac standing 30 feet away, leading a horse that looked exhausted. Kovac himself appeared on the edge of a collapse, his face wrapped in cloth that had frozen stiff from his breath, his movement slow and clumsy in the way that signaled approaching hypothermia. "I have no more wood," Kovac said in English, his accent thicker than usual. "I burned everything. I cannot make it back to town. I will die tonight if you do not help me." Anton pulled Kovac inside immediately. The Hungarian collapsed near the center of the cabin floor directly above the hidden ember bed. Within minutes, the warmth began reviving him. Kovac unwrapped the frozen cloth from his face and looked around the cabin with confusion. There was no fireplace. There was no visible fire of any kind, yet the temperature inside was comfortable enough that Anton wore only a single layer of clothing. "Where is your fire?" Kovac asked. Anton pointed at the iron door in the floor. Kovac stared at it, then at Anton, then back at the door. Understanding came slowly. The stupid underground oven, the thing he had mocked 6 months earlier, was the only reason this cabin remained livable. The brick chamber beneath the floor was radiating stored heat upward, turning the entire floor into a heating element that required minimal fuel to maintain. Anton made food while Kovac thawed. They ate in silence, the Hungarian too exhausted and too humbled to speak. Eventually, Kovac asked how the system worked. Anton explained the principle of thermal mass, the twice-daily coal bed routine, the brick's capacity to store and release heat over extended periods. Kovac listened with the attention of a man whose survival now depended on understanding what he had previously dismissed as madness. "How much wood do you burn each day?" Kovac asked. "Less than half what a fireplace requires," Anton said. Kovac stayed 3 days, waiting for the temperature to rise enough that travel became survivable. During those days, he watched Anton tend the ember bed, observed how little fuel the system actually consumed, and calculated how many lives this technique could save if others adopted it. When the temperature finally climbed to 10 below zero on January 22nd, Kovac prepared to leave. "I was wrong about you," he said before departing. "I am going to build one of these when I return home." Anton nodded but said nothing. Vindication felt less important than simple survival. Spring arrived late in 1844, the land recovering slowly from the brutal winter that had tested every structure and every person in the northern Rockies. As temperatures moderated and trappers emerged from their isolated camps, stories began circulating about who had survived comfortably and who had barely made it through. Anton Novak's name appeared in these conversations with increasing frequency. Though never spoken by Anton himself, he had simply survived the winter using less wood than anyone else, and that fact alone generated intense interest among men who understood how close they had come to freezing. Marek Svoboda arrived at Anton's cabin in late April. Svoboda was Bohemian like Anton, a younger man who had come west only 2 years earlier and was still learning the skills required to survive frontier life. He had heard about the underground heating system from Gregor Thomas, who had carried the story through multiple camps during his spring trading circuit. Svoboda asked directly if Anton would teach him how to build a similar chamber. Anton agreed without hesitation. Over the next week, he walked Svoboda through every step of the construction process. They traveled to a clay deposit where suitable material could be harvested for mortar. Anton explained how to excavate the chamber to exact depth, how to lay bricks in courses that created vertical walls, how to build the raised perimeter that would frame the iron door. He shared the coal bed technique, the twice-daily routine, the calculations about wood consumption and heat retention. Svoboda took careful notes and asked intelligent questions. When he departed, he carried knowledge that would allow him to replicate Anton's innovation on his own land. Anton asked for nothing in return. The information was not secret. It was simply practical knowledge that solved a real problem, and withholding it would serve no purpose. Throughout 1844 and into 1845, the technique spread organically across the trapping territories. Lucas Kovacs built a chamber in his rebuilt cabin, modifying the design slightly to accommodate the materials he could source locally. Pavel Resnick, who had called the system stupid, constructed his own version after nearly losing 3 toes to frostbite during the cold snap. Gregor Thomas, whose trading routes covered hundreds of miles, carried detailed descriptions of the construction method to remote camps where trappers had never heard of Anton Novak but desperately needed better heating solutions. The system was never formalized or standardized. Each builder adapted the core principles to their specific circumstances. Some made the chambers slightly larger or smaller. Some used stone instead of brick when fire bricks were unavailable. Some built raised hearths instead of floor-level installations, but the fundamental concept remained consistent. A brick-lined chamber of appropriate depth, filled with coals that burned slowly, covered with an iron door that controlled airflow and retained heat. By 1846, the phrase hidden ember-bed had entered the vocabulary of frontier construction, though few people knew where the technique had originated. Anton's name was occasionally mentioned, but more often the innovation was simply described as something practical men had figured out during the hard winter of '44. Anton Novak left the Rocky Mountains in the spring of 1847. The fur trade that had sustained him for nearly a decade was collapsing under the weight of depleted beaver populations and changing fashion trends in eastern markets. Silk had replaced felt in hat manufacturing, destroying demand for the pelts that had drawn thousands of men into the wilderness. Anton recognized the shift earlier than most and made practical decisions accordingly. He sold his remaining equipment, closed his cabin for the final time, and joined a wagon train heading to Oregon Territory. He settled on farmland in the Willamette Valley, purchasing acreage that offered fertile soil and reliable water. The transition from trapping to farming required learning entirely new skills, but Anton approached agriculture with the same methodical attention he had applied to cabin construction. He built a modest house, cleared fields, planted crops, and established himself as a competent, if unremarkable, farmer among the growing population of Oregon settlers. In 1848, Anton married Anna Kovar, the daughter of Czech immigrants who had arrived in Oregon 2 years earlier. They had 4 children over the next decade, 3 sons and 1 daughter, all born into a life far removed from the mountain winters that had shaped their father. Anton never spoke to his children about his years as a trapper. That life belonged to a different person in a different time, and he saw no value in dwelling on the past when present demands required his full attention. He died in January of 1873 at the age of 61, buried in a small cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone recorded his name, birth year, death year, and nothing else. His wife and children mourned him as farmers mourn, with quiet grief and practical necessity. The land required continued work regardless of loss. Anton's sons took over the farm operations, and life continued in the ordinary way that most lives continue after death. But in the mountains Anton had left behind, his innovation persisted. Cabins built with hidden ember-bed chambers remained functional decades after their construction. Settlers moving into former trapping territories discovered these structures and recognized their superior heating efficiency. Some occupied the cabins directly, others studied the design and incorporated the principles into new construction. The technique saved lives during harsh winters throughout the 1850s and 60s, though exact numbers remained unrecorded. Survival rarely generates documentation. By the 1880s, most of the original ember-bed cabins had been abandoned or replaced by more modern structures. But scattered across Montana and Wyoming, a few remained standing, weathered but solid, their brick-lined chambers still intact beneath rotting floorboards. These forgotten structures represented something fundamental about frontier innovation. The best solutions often came from necessity rather than theory, spread through demonstration rather than promotion, and outlived their creators not through fame but through simple utility. Anton Novak had built something that worked, shared it freely, and disappeared into ordinary life, leaving behind only bricks and knowledge and the quiet legacy of lives saved by engineering that contradicted conventional wisdom.